So Beth, welcome to the Coronavirus Multispecies Reading Group. It's a delight to engage with these two really interesting papers. One which you've already published, really, cutting edge for almost 10 years ago now, when the more than human and multi-species conversations were just getting started. You kind of anticipated a lot of the concerns that are suddenly so timely because, we're living in a pandemic. And then this newer paper where you're engaging with Canguilhem, and maybe I'll start out by jumping into the newer paper a little bit. And we hear about these para-influenza viruses, respiratory syncytial viruses, rhinoviruses, and it seems in the 1960s, at least, when some of this work was being done at this common cold unit. They were being identified solely by their symptomatic effects on human hosts, but then I also found it really interesting. They're further classified after their environmental preferences. So M for grown on monkey kidney, H for grown on human embryonic or human malignant cancer cells. So I would just love it if you could tell us a little bit more about this cold center. I understand that it largely funded by companies that wanted to have their new cold products tested. So yeah, just tell us more about this place and what drew you to it.
Okay, so I first came across it at an STS conference where another scholar, Tal Bolton, was talking about it as an example of volunteering. And at the time I was interested in how people and bodies got turned into resources for biomedicine. And another paper by a guy called Nigel Clark, who's a sociologist at Lancaster, and what we might call an inhuman geographer. And he had a little segue and wrote this really neat paper around the common cold and then kind of didn't publish it. So I had these two things, and I was reading Haraway's When Species Meet at the same time. And there was a call for papers about where species meet and mingle. And I thought, well, what if instead of looking at species, we looked at viruses? And that drew me to kind of dig deeper into the common cold unit, which ran for nearly, or just over 40 years. So from the immediate post-war period in the UK right through to sort of start of the 1990s. And it kind of started off as a very scientific project. It was about trying to culture and study the common cold in vitro. So loads of the early stuff and some of the oral history material talks in wonderful detail about, sort of heading to the abattoir in the middle of the night to get various bits of cow uterus to develop the materials to culture your viruses. And this sort of real sort of hands-on challenge, the challenge that the virus didn't grow well in animals. So I think their choices were ferrets, and it sort of didn't go well in those, chimpanzees, which were problematic, and human students, which was fine. And I love that, it's better to use human students to test cold viruses and other sort of willing volunteers than human primates. And so it was very much about sort of biological discovery almost for the first few years. But as it kind of evolved and changed over time, Evans Wright became much more of a sort of trial center for commercial remedies. And if you look at the archive, you can kind of see this shift. By the end, it was kind of very much more drug companies were getting them to test stuff to see if it worked to deal with the symptoms of the common cold. And this kind of bigger project of trying to cure the common cold once and for all sort of fell away. And there's some quite interesting speculation about the fact it didn't get the money to do the sort of work we might do on something like Ebola or even the current pandemic, because it just wasn't exciting enough as a virus. It didn't have that charisma that the coronavirus has, and that kind of didn't develop the funding, which is the hypothesis of the people who ran it. And I found that quite interesting as well.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could bring in Canguilhem and, zooming in on one particular passage on page 6, he's saying being healthy might not simply mean being free of pathogens, but a matter of immunocompetence. And that idea of competence, I think, is interesting and maybe in tension with some of the other thinkers that you bring in, like Hinchcliffe and others who are inviting us to think about configurations that result in disease. In part, like, maybe let's speculate, like, if Canguilhem was alive today, would he be out there with Esposito and others, like, fueling the anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers? And maybe this is also in part, like, as people learn that I'm interested in, symbiotic potential of viruses, they're like, oh, how is that different from, being anti-vax or anti-mask? but yeah, I guess in part zooming in on that word, immunocompetence, is maybe a question about the political economy of competence, and who can afford to buy into either the nutritive, like food systems, or the cold remedies. As we all know that there isn't a perfect cold remedy, and maybe if you have any advice, I'm sure we'd all love to know what your favorite cold remedy is. But just that idea of competence of an immune system seems to be nested within just these distributed assemblages that are shaped by histories of race and class and colonialism. So we're just interested in hearing you kind of make some of the authors talk to each other in the paper.
Yeah, I think one of the things I find really interesting about Conguilhem is, for me, there's almost a tension in his work. Sometimes when he writes, it feels very multi-species. So when he talks about Miller, and when he talks about the entanglement of organism and environment, and the idea that conditions ideas of health and disease, it feels very multi-species. But he's also deeply humanist. And what motivates him is sort of, as someone with a medical background, a concern for the well-being of patients. And I think in many ways, these two things sit in tension in his work. So he's kind of open to all these ideas, but at the end of the day, for him, it comes back to the experience of an individual patient and how we can make it better for them, how we can make their life more livable for them. And that sort of picks up on some of the critiques of sort of more relational work that says, we're so caught up in the complexity of relations, we kind of dull our sensitivity to real human pain and suffering, which I don't think is always true, but it's certainly a critique that's leveled. So I think there's this really interesting tension in his work, and maybe in ours as well, of sort of coming back to this sort of humanist reminder that there's people and animals and all kinds of critters at the end of our musings. In terms of political economy, does immunocompetence sort of, is it a luxury of those who can afford it? Well, kind of yes and no, because I think that what makes immunocompetence possible is the wider structures within which we're embedded. And if we have an approach to disease that is very command and control, identify the pathogen. I mean, I love that bit in Conguilhem. I think I put in the paper, he says, to foresee an entity is to foresee an action. To see an entity is to foresee an action. And this kind of idea that we can identify the enemy and go after it. And there's this kind of real overlap between sort of biopolitics and geopolitics and that kind of terminology. And then that's where we throw our resources, right? We throw our resources at defeating the virus once and for all. And that means we don't invest them in things that might build immunocompetence, like furlough schemes, which we had here in the UK, but sort of sick leave and financial support and infrastructures that allow people to be sick. One of the things I loved about the Common Cold Unit is everyone seemed really happy while having kind of really, really terrible colds, but they were in a really lovely rural setting. They were getting well fed, and so there's something about the livability of viral infection is linked to the conditions and the environments within which we find ourselves and what we invest in making those environments livable. So I think that's sort of how it feeds into political economy for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, Rachel, go ahead.
Thanks so much. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more, tease a little bit more out from that then about biosecurity dynamics, because I mean, I think we're seeing this now with the tensions of other ideas or goals of quote unquote living with SARS-CoV-2 is still moving in that same directionality of biosecuritization. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more, just extend what you're already saying and expand to that, because I think these examples that you're giving are really great, and I also see a lot of differences in the other model.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it comes back to the biosecurity for whom and at what level, isn't it? Is it biosecurity for the state? Is it biosecurity for the world? Is it biosecurity for the individual? Is it biosecurity for the community? And then that again affects where you invest your resources. So you could say that the current UK government's adopting a policy of living with. We're kind of pulling back from all these control measures. I didn't quite like the way Boris's words seemed to echo mine. We said we're going to have to learn to live with the virus, and it's like, well, I said that, but I didn't mean it that way. So is it a kind of necropolitics or at least a Foucauldian letting die version of biopolitics we see in that particular state level living with. We're just going to stop trying to deal with this, and you're going to have to learn to live with it. This is an acceptable level of death, if you like. Or is there another biopolitics that the one I'd like to work towards is the one that recognizes that we aren't 100% normalized healthy individuals. It's the one that questions the idea that completely 100% healthy is the norm. And that's why I probably keep coming back to Canguilhem, because he really explores this idea of the normal and the pathological and the sick and diseased, and says maybe it's not normal to be 100% healthy or 100% uninfected, which is really obvious. But it would be really nice if we had a politics that worked towards that as the norm, that assumed, you know, we're not going to be at 100% capacity 100% of the time. And I have a very noisy clock, sorry.
I can't hear it.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
And as
Can't hear it. Thanks, Beth.
Yeah, as usual, if anyone has a question, feel free to just unmute yourself, raise your hand, or type it in the chat, whatever works best. And I've got a million other questions, but if folks want to jump in. Oh, I'll introduce Wim as well. So Wim van der Pol is a virologist joining us from the Netherlands, who was in the news. Wim, I'm introducing you. I don't know how much you heard because your audio was connecting. So he studied the mink cats and the circulation of SARS-CoV-2 in all these different populations. So welcome. Good to have you back. So Wim, we're talking about a philosopher that might not be someone that you've read before, but his name is Canguilhem, someone who famously was the teacher of Michel Foucault, who's another big name. And maybe I'll zoom right in on some of the ways that you introduced Canguilhem in the first paragraph. You know, health and disease are differences of degree, not of kind, and the pathological is to be found in the specificities of human experience, rather than you know, kind of this model of contagion where it's, you know, you identify the virus. And maybe if you could just kind of talk more deeply about Canguilhem's broader project and how this particular bit about disease and health fits in within his broader ideas.
Okay. Again, I think it's something that really fascinated me, that whether we define disease or sort of viral disease in terms of presence or absence, or whether we define it in terms of its symptomatic effects. So in the current pandemic, there's a lot of talk about asymptomatic carriers. So people who are technically infected but have none of the symptoms of disease. And do we classify them as healthy, or do we classify them as sick? Do we classify them as diseased and infectious, or do we classify them as normal? And in some ways, I think Canguilhem's sort of reflections on this, you know, we can't divide the normal and the pathological and the sick and disease in this way. It's a much more nuanced thing, I think is really helpful, because it kind of suggests that rather than a drive which seeks to eradicate the virus, we kind of need to think about a way where we can maybe recognize it's always going to be present, and think about how we intervene in ways that make that relationship more livable, more bearable. And that comes back to what we were saying, the fact that we only knew viruses there symptomatically before we had all the tests, before we could sort of think the only way we could tell if we had a virus or we didn't was through symptoms. Mm-hmm. And so there's a really interesting history about how we know viruses through symptoms. So we think viruses are always symptomatic, and something quite interesting is going on there for me.
Yeah, and I think we've seen a real shift over the pandemic too. Like initially it was just symptoms, and I thought I had symptoms. Like in the first, you know, in March 2020, like I had a really bad cold, and I was like laid up, and you know, the pandemic anxiety is coming through. And then I got you know, many months later, I was able to get a antibody test, and in fact, no, I didn't have antibodies to spike. But now, you know, not only do we have these antibody tests, but we've got the PCR tests that let you differentiate between, you know, viral loads that probably are non-transmissible. So at this point in the pandemic, you can get a positive PCR test and not even be capable, you know, kind of physically of transmitting virus. but it seems that the lateral flow tests in some ways are a better diagnostic, because it'll tell you if you're capable of passing on the virus or not. But yeah, I was wondering if you might just reflect more on these differential politics of living with. Also on page 4, you talk about the Orientalism in biopolitics defining which communities in here should be protected. So you've talked broadly about the UK situation, but do you see different kind of biopolitical strategies? I mean, I had the privilege of inhabiting, the Oxford bubbles, but it seems like, is there any N here that's being created anymore, or is it all is it a messier situation right now?
Is there any?
Is there an N here that's being protected?
Oh, okay, all right.
Nested zones of like a bubble to invoke, the work of Sloterdijk, who we've touched on a couple of times.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say it is, but it is more complicated. So it's you can see that in here protectionism maybe in the distribution of vaccines, certainly. So leaders, certainly here in the UK, our leadership's making strategic decisions to boost its own population, to do a third dose for its own population, rather than export necessarily vaccines to places where there are none. And that definitely, to me, sort of sounds like that in here philosophy. And when they were trying to argue for the export of vaccine doses, the rationale for that was that same protectionist. The thing that seemed to compel people was not necessarily altruism, though that was part of it. It was also the idea that this thing's going to keep circulating. There'll be more dangerous foreign variants. So again, you can hear that discourse there. In the UK, it was all about this kind of South African variant, and we're like very, very quiet about the Kent variant. That's homegrown, that's probably a bit safer. And so I think that sort of rhetoric is still part of the conversation. But at the same time, you've got other pressures going on where we need to open up. We need to unlock, we need to open up our borders. In the UK, it's kind of intersected in really interesting ways with discourses around Brexit, so the UK leaving the European Union. And these two sort of different forms of nationalism sort of play into each other in interesting ways. So there is definitely still an in here, but it's maybe nuanced with a reluctant admittance we might be reliant on other kinds of trade networks and connections. Maybe there's a bit of an in club as well in terms of the sort of red, green, orange zones. There was some really interesting geopolitics going on there about who was in your green zone, and all sort of kinds of political signaling about that, and often didn't seem to be grounded in the data from my perspective. Well, when red, green and orange wasn't always a sort of decision driven by the scientific data.
And maybe, unless other people have questions and want to jump in, going from the current moment back to this research unit that you were spending some time with the archives. So maybe tell us more about just so the infected students. What was their experience like? What kinds of treatments kind of cycled through here, and which were kind of stabilized as something that kind of went on to be marketed, and which were shuttled off and never developed into the commercial products.
Yeah, I haven't yet. I need to do more digging, found a lot of detail of exactly what was tested when, maybe because it was proprietary, so it didn't turn up in the boxes I was looking in. There was, as I said, this broad shift from just trying to extract culture, transfer, and kind of re-inoculate people with viruses. So there were some wonderful experiments going on where they tried to intensify the risk of infection. So they kind of shut people in wardrobes and spray them with the Portadown Impingor, named after Portadown, another big military research facility in the UK. Or they wanted to try and find out if being cold made you more susceptible to colds. So they put people's feet in baths of icy water and these kind of things. So there were some really wonderful experiments they were developing. And they sort of characterized themselves as dispelling all these myths about things that will or will make you more susceptible to colds. And so that there was this sort of quite fun experimental feel, and it was in the immediate post-war period. And so one of the reasons they were so successful in recruiting volunteers is because when they started, we still had rationing. And so they were basically bribing people with food and accommodation and a free holiday in the immediate post-war period. And you can see that in all the imagery. It's almost got this, I don't know if you have Butlins where you are, this kind of holiday camp tradition we have in the UK, and it just feels a little bit like Butlins and the posters and 10-day free holiday and all this kind of stuff. It's got this kind of feel to it. I think later on it became more like the commercial clinical trials we might have today. So if I see it sort of antecedents in the Cardiff Centre that we chatted a bit about, and some of the private centres, it's much more, we'll shut you in a hotel room for 10 days with a free Game Boy and we'll pay you a decent amount of money. So I think some of that early sort of fun element of the common cold unit's gone, and it does appeal to the kind of people that like the way clinical trials pay but wouldn't want to go for the sort of more extreme versions. So it's sort of, yeah, lost some of that scientific experimentation, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm cycling back to your earlier paper now, to just think about, yeah, I mean, I'd love to just hear, as this paper came out, like what kind of reception, you know, part of what we've been doing is just like inventorying the archive of viral work and multi-species studies and more than human studies. And, you know, until recently, when there's been a glut, there wasn't much of it. So this is one of the very first early papers that, you know, is taking some insights from Haraway. And, you know, I think it's interesting, like Haraway herself, at least within Species Meet, doesn't focus on like what we know about, for example, the human genome being viral in origin. And this is something that you're engaging with in this paper. So maybe do you want to speak to, you know, these ideas, you know, as articulated by Anna Singh and others, that, you know, human nature is a multi-species relationship. Like how are you starting to rethink that in the context of viruses?
I mean, I think when I first read about that the viruses are kind of part of our DNA almost, I thought that was really fascinating as a challenge to this archetypal virus is bad, virus is infection. And then the way that viruses in some ways are increasingly the tools or machines of biology, on certainly things like stem cell therapies and the development of vaccines. I mean, the AstraZeneca vaccine was developed on a chimpanzee cold virus. So this idea that there's been a very long conversation between our bodies and immune systems and viruses that shapes who we are makes you concerned about what it might be to be uninfected. It's almost like if you're uninfected, that's weird. If you've never been exposed to viruses, if you're distant from viruses, it makes me think of the specific pathogen-free mice in scientific experimentation and just how sick they are, you know, all the environmental modifications you have to make just to keep them alive. So I think you're right. The idea of viruses sort of deep within us and the multi-species self really challenges that idea that viruses can ever be externalized and that never to be infected is a good thing.
Yeah, and you know, I think there's some members of the mobile DNA community and others that are trying to, you know, when you wrote this paper, I think there was just largely a lot of speculation about what all this viral DNA might be doing to us, and I think they're just starting to characterize the really complicated ways that transposons and you know, these so-called jumping genes are you know, inducing changes throughout the lifetime of an organism, but also how one just kind of image that I can't get out of my mind is that you know, some of these viral elements in our genome actually form viral particles. Like they've got the caspid proteins, and then it like exits from a cell and then goes into another cell within your own body. So yeah, just thinking about the, you know, human nature is something inherently unstable has been, yeah, just it's infected my thinking recently. Maybe just more about, you know, I'm going through these lovely pictures. You've got a promotional photo of the CCU here, you know, these women sitting in very 1960s couches, having a pleasant conversation. So maybe if you could talk about the myth busting, like what myths were busted. So does being cold give you colds, or what kinds of things did they find out?
I think they concluded it didn't, but I've read other papers since that argued the opposite. So I suspect the jury's still out on that one. lots of, so that they used to complain they got all these letters with all these things. I think I had a list, was it Dettol, oil, vinegar, World War One gas, all these snuff, all these things that are supposed to cure the common cold, and they did do some myth busting. But I wanted to kind of think a little bit about how that environment and that imagery was also very domestic, because I know some of the people who are interested in ideas of domesticity and how things become domesticated. And a lot of the way they talked about the virus and the sort of environment they created it, it's quite a homely, wholesome, in accordance to the imagery environment. And similarly, they talked about their viruses as domesticated, as pets. So they even named them, before they had this other nomenclature, they named them after the people they extracted them from. So people, if they caught a cold, would take a swab and put it in the freezer, and it would become one of the unit's pet viruses. And so they almost had this sort of strange affection for them. And it's this idea that they then became less virulent. So they had this wonderful experiment where they took a bunch of people to a remote island and isolated them from viral infection for about 3 months. And then they brought in one of their pedigree sort of specially cultured cold viruses, and they couldn't get anyone to get sick. And it wasn't until they brought someone in from the mainland who had a real wild cold that everybody got sick. And I just thought that story was really, really fascinating. So what is it about that domestic environment that makes the virus seemingly less infectious, and this distinction they draw between wild colds that haven't been cultured in the body and domesticated colds? I thought this was, again, really, really interesting, and it kind of speaks to the fact, is it the environment, is it the virus, and what does this say about ideas of the domestic, the idea you can domesticate a virus? I found quite interesting.
Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Beth. It's so interesting. So I'm wondering, is some kind, the work of that CCU, is there any consensus now emerging about how the common cold works? And it's a very naive question, and how to protect from it. I'm thinking in particular, I've been thinking through Asian, or rather alternative medicine styles of thinking immunity, where in a way there are two versions. One is constant exposure and the training of the immune system is, and including occasional disease outbreaks, is one way immunity works. And the other one is one of a body building barriers or layers that would then help the body fight off the pathogen itself, or maybe just prevent the body from getting any reaction at all. So, but from what I read from you and others is that there is still a lot of uncertainty of how it actually works. And also the question that came up recently, what does it mean if you have a strong reaction to the vaccination versus no reaction? So how, do you think there's any consensus or any real common ground emerging?
Well, not specifically from the Common Cold Unit. That's closed down, as has the Cardiff unit that succeeded it. So there's not a lot of money or energy in common cold research. And as I said, I think probably because it is quite common. And it's, of course, not one virus. It's, sometimes they use that term for coronavirus infection, sometimes it's rhinovirus infection. So there's a whole bunch of viruses that cause the set of symptoms we recognize as common cold, perhaps. So it might not be one thing or another thing. There was a rumor recently that the work that had happened on coronavirus might be opening up the new possibility of a cure for the common cold again. Although I haven't followed that through yet to see where it's going. If you look on the NHS website, we're just back to honey and lemon. That's the honey and lemon, and preferably not antibiotics. So there's a kind of very sort of standard set of information. Do other cultures have other ideas of what common colds are and how we should deal with it? I think that's a really fascinating question. I mean, there's a really lovely project sort of just looking around at these really long, the common cold's been around for yonks. They had some really nice old sort of lists of remedies, the kind of Mrs. Beecham's list of remedies for common cold. So there's probably a really nice project just looking at all the different ways people have tried to cure it and the things they assembled to do that. I think South African brandy works great, but I don't know whether that was just the numbing powers of brandy or whether it actually did anything.
It's the simple uncertainty whether it's good to be infected now? You know, that everyone was talking about how after the pandemic, when we stayed at home, we were all wearing masks. So what happens now with the common cold returning into social life? Is it stronger now? Is it a good sign, or what to make of that?
So as someone who spent the past 3 weeks with various forms of cold, I think it's terrible. But I probably reflect the norm in that it's another space for a lot of speculation and not much evidence. I think we've had, particularly if you didn't have kids, you had 18 months of very limited exposure, and then you go back to the world where you're regularly exposed to viruses, and a lot of people seem to be getting colds. But all this is anecdotal. So we don't know whether people are getting more colds or they're not getting more colds. If they're feeling the colds, they're getting more because they haven't had one for a while. I think these are...
We don't know. That's what you're saying. Even though you read up on the literature, you're still saying we don't know.
That's my sense. I mean, I'm sure there's more.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Maybe there's evidence out there. But again, I don't think the common cold, there's that much. It's not, it's not Ebola, it's not coronavirus, it's something, I periodically stop and have a dig around to look, but it's certainly not sort of headline grabbing.
I see that you've unmuted yourself. Do you want to?
Yeah, well, I was something for discussion also. Don't you think there are differences between common colds in different regions and also in different time frames? I would expect there are differences in common cold and also in the immunity against common cold, because people have more, were earlier exposed to the common cold of their own region or their own time lab. And I think, another aspect is the co-evolution. You said in a certain region, people are not susceptible to common cold, or seem less susceptible, or seem to have developed good immunity against common cold. It could be due to the fact that there is co-evolution of the different pathogen with these people in that certain region. What do you think about that, or how do you look at that?
I think that sounds completely right. How do you look at it? Well, Evan was saying that he mentioned the idea of doing a kind of biogeography of cold viruses.
Yeah.
We do this with flu, don't we? We sort of culture different strains and look at the sort of biodiversity of flu viruses. And
but it's probably not only the flu virus. There's probably a combination with other pathogens, or maybe low pathogenic agents that interact with the flu virus during the circulation of such viruses.
So yeah, in that case, you would definitely have a regional effect, wouldn't you? And it would be linked to how often people move within areas. It would be linked to so Canguilhem talks a lot about terrain, as in the specificity of bodies. So their immunohistories, where they've lived before, things they've been infected before, and milieu, so the specificities of the environment.
Yep.
So whether that's the kind of winter effect of everyone being shut in buildings with the windows closed, or whether that's, the fact that it's a high stress environment. All right. So stress, I think, has been shown to be linked to immunity. So does that make you more susceptible?
Yep.
Or is it a sort of healthy rural environment? Do you have space to recover? I think there's some evidence that the duration of colds is linked to whether or not you can stop and rest or not. That's why I think in some ways cold remedies are problematic, because they're marketed on it, you've got to keep going kind of philosophy. We're going to give you this, you're going to take this magic pill and you can keep going through your day. So that all these sort of drug strategies, environments, things, and then you're right, there's the diversity of the virus itself. It evolves, it mutates. That's probably why we get a distinctiveness between the ones in lab and the ones in the environment, and how that then feeds into. So it's almost like each infection is unique.
Yeah, and the behavior is also a bit changing now, because people are now advised, please stay at home when you're infected. And in former years, we always would say, well, if you still feel well, you can still go to work. And now the attitude is more like stay at home when you're infected, even if you don't feel sick. Even if you don't feel sick, yes.
I love that. It's acceptable to stay at home with a cold now, and where it never was before.
Yeah, that's good in some way also, huh? Yeah, that's probably also the reason that we see less flu now.
Beth, I was wondering if you've thought at all about these, ideas about viral biogeography in the context of not only space but time. It seems like a lot of the literature on pandemics is about globalization and all this. But if you think about the viral biodiversity of the common cold and Anthropocene imaginaries, that could be a way of opening up some other interesting questions.
Well, they talk about sort of fossil viral DNA, don't they? So viral DNA has these wonderfully long histories. There's a kind of biogeography just within us of a kind of history of encounters with past viruses that I think even can be a form of archaeological evidence now. So that's fascinating. We've got these really long histories of co-evolution that shape who we are. I think Felicity Callard's work on coronavirus made me think about duration, because she's written about long COVID and the way that when medicine defines a disease, particularly when they define it symptomatically as a set of symptoms, it normally comes with a built-in duration. This should last about 2 weeks, and if it lasts longer, go and see your doctor. Or the average coronavirus infection should last 3 weeks. And of course, we've seen with coronavirus and long COVID, it clearly doesn't. The effects can last much longer. I don't know if we've ever asked those questions about colds, because the way most of the time we've been sensible and sensitive to colds is through infection. So when the symptoms go, our relationship dies away. And we don't have that encounter. We can see it in other people, but our sort of consciousness of viral presence disappears. I mean, we don't have lateral flow tests for the common cold. What would that show? What would that tell us about the amount of this virus circulating in the population all the time? That sounds quite like quite fun. No one will fund it, but wouldn't that be a fun study to do, right? And why are we just testing for one virus and sort of singling it out? Why can't we sort of do a viral profile? What are all these things living in us now?
Zia, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I haven't quite formulated it as a question yet, but I wondered if this question of temporalities is quite interesting, and potentially there's an interest in, we were talking earlier on about how much of our DNA is human DNA is viral in origin, and there's this interesting, in terms of duration, there's this interesting deep time perspective where viruses can come to seem as those are often the scenarios in which viruses come to seem charismatic, in that they're like, all these ways they've contributed to our DNA, and they build up the placenta and they hone our immune system. And then in the short term, there's this like panic driven around pathogenicity. But yeah, it's not really a question yet, but that question of duration and the population level at which we go, evolution happens at this scale. But yeah, sorry, I'm still trying to think about what the question in there is. But just this interest in when something becomes evil and when it becomes good from a kind of theoretical perspective.
I think it overlaps in interesting ways with the epidemic and the endemic, because epidemic is something that's concentrated in sort of, well, it's sort of spatially spread but concentrated in time, isn't it? And Gilles van Loon talks about them as hot zones and vortexes, and it kind of creates this real intensity. And I think you're right, this kind of sense of panic around a particular human virus assemblage at a particular point in time. But when something becomes endemic, it loses some of that intensity. So endemic for me is almost another term for having learned to live with. And this week I had this student, and I'm trying to remember her name. She did this great master's project. So it was only a short project, and she went into the New Forest just down the road from me here and looked at Lyme disease. So this is a tick-borne disease, and she was curious about how local people felt about Lyme disease. You're living in this epidemic space, aren't you worried about Lyme disease? And they weren't. They'd lived with it for years. This thing was around for years, and the science was uncertain, and some people thought it made them very sick, and there was a push for more awareness. But generally, if you went up to people in the street and said, "Are you worried about Lyme disease?" They went, "No, it's just always been here. You just wear long trousers and get on with it." And it's not necessarily linked to the harm a particular virus might do us, or its pathogenicity, or how sick it makes us. It's how long we've lived with it. And that seemed to be linked into this idea of endemic and this idea of duration. So how long you've shared space with a particular virus shapes your capacity to live with it.
Rachel, go ahead. You've got a comment in the chat.
Yeah, I think going along with that, I was struck by the use of the term dysbiosis on page 20 of that latest work that that you're doing. And I just would love to hear you say more about that in relation to the concepts you were just talking about. And what was the other term, Evan, that you mentioned earlier? You were honing in on a phrase or a term. I don't know. I can't remember now, but it might be
competence from Canguilhem.
Competence. Okay. All right. Yeah. I would just love to hear you say more about this concept of dysbiosis, because you do afterwards draw a quotation a few sentences later about pathogenicity and different individual level responses then in the work.
Okay, yeah. So it's kind of inspired by spending a lot of time with Jamie Lorimer, who's written about probiotics. And so the idea that some relationships are positive as well as negative, but also in contrast, the idea disease is defined by presence or absence of an infectious agent. It's the idea that healthiness is more linked to lots of different viruses, microbes, etc., being in balance, or certainly achieving a point of balance. And so symbiosis is when the balance seems to be one that allows flourishing for most of the participants in a way that we would describe as feeling healthy. And dysbiosis is the sense that illness or a feeling of being unwell is derived from these things being out of sync or out of balance. And so in the sort of current work where we're thinking about microbes, do we intervene in the microbiome to get rid of the bad germs, so to speak? Or do we intervene in the microbiome to try and create a more balanced ecology that equates with the feeling of being healthy, or a feeling of what makes life livable? So is it about the presence or absence of particular viruses, microbes, genes even, or is it more about things being in balance at a point where we feel we can live our best everyday life, or at least a good everyday life?
Part of what you were saying earlier about the dynamics of endemic Lyme disease infections is helping me reflect on anti-vax sentiments in West Papua, one of the places where I work. So, you know, there, well before the pandemic, I'd say about 5 years ago, I went and a measles outbreak had just killed like 50 young kids in this one village, and the controversy at that point was about not getting access to these vaccines that are cheap and widely available. But now it's very difficult to convince my friends who are human rights activists, who are church leaders, you know, that it's worth getting a vaccine. And I think, you know, in part, it's like the fact that they are living with measles, with tuberculosis, with malaria, with dengue, and all these other things. So this one particular, you know, other new emergent disease doesn't seem that pathogenic compared to the ones that they're already living with. But I think it's also maybe something related to, you talk, AstraZeneca is one of the vaccines that's available there. I didn't realize that it was a virus until I went into the History of Science Museum in Oxford over the weekend and saw the sculpture there. Do you know anything more about that? You know, I would imagine some anti-vax sentiment is being fueled by just this fear of synthetic biology and a fear of, you know, engineered life and the potential that has to destabilize the human condition.
I keep wanting people to distinguish between sort of the viruses made with the sort of more novel techniques and the ones made in the more sort of traditional way, but I haven't heard it. Again, that's probably something you could explore a bit more systematically. I've heard viral nationalism. I want the Oxford virus because it's British. I mean, for goodness sake, or these kind of things. Or I don't want this one because of where it comes from. But I haven't heard people link it to specific techniques. In terms of sort of anti-vax sentiment in a particular context, I know a little about Papa, but I do love a phrase that Veena Das used when she was talking about non-compliance in taking antibiotics in India. And she talked about local ecologies of care and sort of the idea that there's a local ecology of knowledge about health and disease. And it was really interesting in India because it was a combination of what we'd probably describe as Western science and existing holistic medicine and what their mum had always done. And I think people stitch together their responses to things like vaccinations or diseases, not just from the messaging from public health systems, but that they'll draw evidence from the experiences of their friends. So it only takes one person you know to have a bad reaction to a vaccine for it to put off your whole sort of group. Because we do this kind of stitching together. We don't hear public health messaging in isolation. And sometimes it'll resonate. Sometimes the way that the medicine-induced vaccine might kind of harmonize really well with a particular set of beliefs or understandings of the way these things work. And at other times there's a complete sort of dissonance. And it makes it really hard for people to see themselves and their understanding of health and disease in the particular technology that comes across. And of course, medical anthropology is brilliant at showing this. That book, When People Come First, was full of stories of this kind of dissonance between particular forms of knowledge and particular forms of local experience.
Just an additional observation from West Papua. People were more comfortable using their cold remedies for COVID. So you know, one guy who was ready to, like, it was a point in the pandemic there when you know, the hospitals were filled, they were running out of oxygen. He was a filmmaker and he was ready to go in and you know do this filming. And I was like, I can't hire you on this project unless you get a vaccine. That doesn't seem like, I don't want to kill you. And he's like, no, you know, 2 people at work have already died from COVID and I'm taking my vitamins, I'm eating my vegetables, I'm like being healthy. It's like, that was his, you know, the vaccine was something new, something that might not, there was also a racial discourse. There was an idea that, you know, maybe this is not tested on Melanesian bodies and Melanesian biologies, and you know, we don't trust it yet. But yeah, this has been really fruitful for helping me think about the West Papua stuff. Jack, I see you've got a hand up too.
Yeah, I think it's really striking how significant the word cold, or the role that's playing here. And I'm just wondering about sort of the ontological differences between colds and viruses for lots of the people involved in the CCU. I can imagine people who might be willing to contract a cold, but would balk at the idea of contracting a virus. And so I wonder whether that sort of played a role here too. There was sort of the familiarity of the cold as opposed to the threat of the virus, even if they are exactly the same in terms of, you know, biological identities. So I wonder how far that's playing a role.
I think you're right. It's the common cold as well. It's not the scary exotic one. It's the common one. It's, you know, it's very everyday. So I think you're exactly right. There was an interesting line I found in some of the sort of letters where they talked about how, having got people in to do the cold virus test, they were able to recruit them to test more challenging things, like sort of influenza type, sort of, you know, they could give them and test some of the cures for that, or sort of really horrible. But basically, if you were okay with a common cold test, you might be willing to try out some of the nastier viruses they had in stock and develop remedies for. So there's a sort of process of acculturation and again, domesticity, which I think kind of picks up on that point as well.
Good to see you, Vim. Hope to see you back. Actually, you've used the word domesticity a couple of times, but we haven't engaged yet with the idea of domestication, which you introduce on page 293 in your earlier publication. And this is something that's come up. Charlotte Brevis in more recent work has been talking about you know, domesticating viruses more in the context of like something like HIV, where you might take a pathogen and you know, within a patient who's stuck with the virus, domesticate it. But it seems like you're in this paper using it in a little bit of a different sense, and this sort of way a virus might be domesticated by a lab so that it might grow better. So it's less fussy about the conditions of growth, as one of your interlocutors said. Do you want to say anything more about this idea of domestication?
Yeah, again, I think it's well, in some ways, you think cold viruses were always domesticated because they're something that circulates in human populations and in human homes. So you could say that the whole co-evolutionary history is domesticated in that sense. It's a domestic virus. It sort of shares our space. But yeah, in the paper, I also think about how learning to grow viruses in the lab was a process of domestication. It was about finding the right food and finding the right temperatures and finding the right environment, but also simultaneously a process of acculturation, because in almost ironically, in the mission to get rid of the virus, they created a space where everyone could live with it, whether that lives with it in the lab and it thrives in the lab, or whether it's in the patient volunteers and ways of infecting them, but also making the infection bearable for them, even attractive for them. It's really, really interesting. So it's kind of something about trying to make maybe something that's always been domestic more comfortable as well, in that sense. How can we make this connection we already have more comfortable for everybody involved, more livable? Again, it's probably why I'm drawn to Congo and its emphasis on experience, specificities of experience as opposed to presence absence.
Super interesting paper. Are those more? Oh, that's I thought I saw something in the chat. Any final thoughts from you, Beth, or any final questions from anyone else? I could pick out other things from the paper.
I'd love to know what Melanie's pictures of.
I've always thought it was an ant. Is it an ant, Melanie? She has a little baby, so sometimes she isn't able to stay right next to the computer.
I have to get you to ask her for me.
It's the baby's ant, and he's a bit sick today, so I'm multitasking, but I'm listening, but not very presently.
You're living with the cold, or something else.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. But it seems like an eye infection or something like that. But I mean, definitely very interesting to observe a baby and or live with a baby and just think about all these things you mentioned, like, you know, when because we constantly are surrounded by pathogens, and sometimes it makes them sick, sometimes not. Yeah, very, very interesting. I was wondering, what is it that is so specific to the cold? Because I observe a lot that people just say, people have a cold, but they say, oh, I have the flu. So like, what is the relationship there? Is it if when the cold becomes too much, it's a flu, but it's, you know, I mean, maybe now with COVID, people become more specific about what kind of virus they have. It's, you know, very interesting.
I think medically they're separate things. I mean, we have vaccines for flu, we don't have vaccines for the common cold, for example. So there is a distinction. But I think sort of commonly, I mean, people talk about incredibly gendered. They talk about man flu, you know. So there's this idea that when men have a cold, it's always flu, which has all kinds of sort of problematic ideas about gender and how we should respond to things and this kind of stuff. So that there are these sort of common definitions that aren't necessarily corresponding with the sort of technical classification of this virus as a cold virus, this virus is a flu virus, that circulate. And it kind of links again to the fact that we don't have, again, a lateral flow test for flu, and we don't have a lateral flow test for the common cold. So the only way we try and divine what virus we're encountering is through the symptoms. And so you can go onto the NHS in the UK symptom checker and you can go, well, I haven't got a temperature, so it's probably a cold, or, you know, I'm shivering, so it's probably flu. But this is all kind of a process of self-diagnosis. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I empathize with the young children. It does help the viruses circulate, I think.
And you would imagine with the infrastructure that's been rolled out, like my sister's a primary care physician, and you know, now she has the ability to do PCR tests just in, you know, last couple of months. And now that you've got that basic big kit in a lot of doctors' offices, you can imagine that, you know, there would and could be these diagnostic capabilities in the near future. Zia, do you want to ask your question that's in the chat? No? Yes?
Yeah. Again, yeah, kind of more kind of a comment, but I was really struck by, I found quite exciting this idea of the what you were saying about notions of sickness and health in Canguilhem's work, and your thoughts on kind of productivity and conditions of recovery. And I was kind of just reminded of Sontag's idea of the kingdom of the sick, and sickness is not a kind of exceptional subhuman category, but as something that's inherent in living, but that we see it as, we frequently section it off and see it as this kind of exceptional thing to be hidden, or that we're not fully ourselves when we're sick. And yeah, I was kind of interested in this notion of what it would mean to rather than living in a kingdom of the healthy, think of the world as in some way already sick, and what if we built the world for towards a consistent notion of sickness and pathology, rather than one in which we are consistently striving towards a kind of impossible category of health that we never fully achieve. Anyway, yeah, that was one thing that came up for me.
I think you're complete. I mean, one of the reasons they built the Common Cold Units, they were concerned about the amount of time workers were taking off sick. So it's exactly linked to that, this kind of idea of the healthy, normalized, productive individual, and how do we guarantee those, as opposed to how do we give people the time and space they need to spend time working out whatever it is they're working out with the virus, and then bring them back in. So yeah.
So thank you so much, Beth, for this really delightful discussion. And thanks for so many people coming into the Zoom room. Rachel, do you remember what we've got on tab for next week?
I think we have Lisa Onaga and
Cool.
other scholars coming to talk to us about their special issue on philosophy of science and COVID.
Great, yeah. So
I think three authors from different locations, and Lisa and Giovanni for as editors.
Lisa's done some really amazing work over the years in multi-species histories related to cocoon cultures, and yeah, is currently at the Max Planck here in Berlin. So it should be a really good discussion. And thanks again, Beth. A big virtual clap from Zoom rooms around the world. Really generative, important, timely, and also pioneering articles that you've offered to us. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you for taking the time to read them and for the discussion. It was really great to meet you and see you all again.
Okay.
Thanks, Beth.
See you soon. Ciao.